The final chapter on JFK, Chapter 19, Segment 5, Fred Who?
Welcome back to Chapter 19. This segment is Fred Who? The answer to that question is Fred Korth. And if you can think back a little bit earlier in this series, we talked about Fred Korth being the man responsible for one of the three scandals that was encircling Lyndon Johnson just prior to Kennedy's death. In this segment, while we will discuss the degree of corruption that Fred Korth was involved with LBJ, that doesn't necessarily bring him into the Kennedy assassination, and that's, of course, why he's in the section yes, no, or maybe so. And we'll examine that right now. Korth had the opportunity, I'm not saying we can prove it, and that's why it's in yes, no, or maybe so. But he had the opportunity to have direct contact with Lee Harvey Oswald, a contact that in his position as Secretary of Navy would allow the government to correct a wrong that Lee Harvey Oswald desperately wanted to change. And that was his military discharge status. He wanted it changed back to honorable. Lyndon Johnson's buddy, the guy who Johnson planned Kennedy's trip with, John Connally, who was appointed Secretary of the Navy as requested by Johnson, when Connally decided to leave that position and go back to Texas and run for governor, Connally left on January 1st, 1962, and at that same time, well, technically several days later, JFK appointed Korth to take that position because LBJ lobbied for it. That was the one position that LBJ was granted, and he put Fred Korth into that post right after Connally left. And if you can imagine, in less than a week after holding office in that post, January of 1962, first thing he did was overruled a top Navy officer and switched a contract for a helicopter, the X-22, to Bell Helicopter, a Texas company, and a company where Fred Korth had served on the board of directors. He was in office a week, switched the contract, gave it to his old company, ignoring what all of the military officials wanted. The second thing Korth did, if you can imagine, is he overruled a contract for the C-5A Galaxy transport airplane, and he shipped it to Marietta, Georgia, to Lockheed. Interestingly enough, the exact home of Richard Russell, who, of course, became a Warren Commission member of Johnson's Presidential Commission investigating the assassination of John F. Kennedy. That wasn't the dirty part. We, of course, know with the TFX, it was the dirty part, and that was the part that involved $6.5 billion in government contracts, making 1,700 planes that was supposed to go to Boeing Corporation because it was the low bid and because it had better test data, and the bid from Boeing would have saved our government anywhere from $150 million to $400 million. And Fred Korth shifted that contract, ignored three separate Pentagon selections to have that plane go to Boeing, and he awarded it to General Dynamics in Fort Worth, Texas. The full story on that is that Fred Korth forgot to tell people that he was the head of a bank that had lent General Dynamics $400 million to build their airplane plants And the bank was on the hook for that. And unfortunately, in 1960, General Dynamics wasn't doing well, and they lost $27 million. And in 1961, General Dynamics was doing even worse, and they lost $141 million. And the predictions were that if General Dynamics did not get the TFX contract, they would be bankrupt. And not only would they be bankrupt, but chances are the bank that Fred Korth had headed would have been bankrupt too. Now, just because Fred Korth was dirty for 22 months until his forced resignation on November 1st, 1963, just because Korth was dirty on a number of military contract awards, all to Lyndon Johnson's buddies and all to benefit himself, doesn't mean that he would have used his position to contact, directly or indirectly, Lee Harvey Oswald, who had written a letter to the former Secretary of the Navy, John Connally, asking the Secretary of the Navy to review his case and to change his discharge status. Now, maybe Fred Korth never got the letter, even though it would have come at a time that he had just taken over as Secretary of the Navy. And of course, because Fred Korth and John Connally were close friends with Lyndon Johnson, both being placed into the position of Secretary of the Navy by LBJ, and both who had worked with LBJ and had been on his campaigns from the 1940s. That doesn't mean that Korth had been given that material, or he would have used that material about Lee Harvey Oswald to his advantage, and perhaps have Oswald do things as a patsy, hoping to get his discharge status changed. It is clear that Fred Korth knew people who may have touched Lee Harvey Oswald. One of them was a person by the name of Mac Wallace, who was Johnson's muscle, and definitely Jack Ruby, who many people have accused being Oswald's handler for Johnson. And of course, this would explain Jack Ruby's behavior in the years just before his death, accusing Johnson of being involved in the assassination. Fred Korth, a man associated closely with Lyndon Johnson going back all the way to 1948. A man whose bank he headed prior to becoming the Secretary of the Navy was about to go down along with the General Dynamics company if they weren't awarded the TFX contract by Fred Korth. And of great interest is the fact that Korth, as the Secretary of the Navy, and as the lawyer who, in one of his few cases, handled the divorce for Lee Harvey Oswald's mother back in 1948, representing the father in that case, he held the keys to getting Lee Harvey Oswald's undesirable discharge reversed and changed back to honorable discharge, which is the one thing that Lee Harvey Oswald wanted. And he not only had that power of change over Lee Harvey Oswald, but he had the relationships with Johnson, with John Connally, with Cliff Carter, who he was with in El Paso with Connally and Johnson and Kennedy. But he had connections with Malcolm Wallace and Jack Ruby. It seems clear that Fred Korth is somehow involved in the inner circle in the Kennedy assassination, right with Lyndon Johnson, right with John Connally, and right with Cliff Carter. With that said, see you in the next segment.